Okay, this is grade 5, lesson 71. We're talking about fractions, decimals, and percent. So a few things that we need to remember. For a fraction, we can make it into a decimal, we can make it into a percent, and we can do either one, percent to fraction, decimal to fraction. It doesn't matter, as long as we know one, we can do the others. So for a fraction, if we had 2/10, if this is a 10 or a 100 or 1000, we could make it into that decimal just by moving the numerator. So the denominator has 1 0. So that means I have my decimal point and one number after it. So that gives me that number 2 after there. Now remember, this is only if we have a 10, 100, or 1000, anything that ends in that 0. If it's a 8, if it's a 5, then there's a different situation to make it into a decimal percent. So then what we do is, to make it into that percent, we always take it and we multiply it by 10, or we move the decimal point 2 places over to the right. So if I move that decimal point 2 places over to the right, I have a space here. That means I need to put the 0 there, and then I drop that decimal because it's over here, or I move it to where it needs to be, and now it's 20%. So from a fraction, 2/10, and remember, percent means of 100, of 100. So it has to be of 100%. 100% is where we're at, just like we have 100 cents in that dollar. So when we go from 2/10 to 20%, it's not 2%, but 20%. Because even if I take this and I multiply it by 10, multiply that by 10, then we get 20, and we get over 100. So that's 20 out of 100, or 20%. Okay, we're going to look at a few examples and see how we can do this. So let's say that time we started with the fraction and we moved it into the percent and into the decimal. This time we're going to start with a percent. So let's say we start with 30%. Okay, 30%. I think I'll use a different color for that just to make it more visible for you. Okay, let's try, there we go, 30%. So if we have 30%, we can make that into the decimal by taking that decimal and moving it 2 to the left. Excuse me, 2 to the left. So if I move it 2 to the left, if I write that 30 down, move it 2 to the left, now I have 0.30, or 30/100ths. When I make that fraction, remember this is out of 100. So I can take that 30, that's my numerator, and then I have out of 100, that's my denominator. So my fraction would be 30/100ths. I can also take and drop those zeros off because I have 2 of them, they match up. I can drop those zeros off, and it would be the same as 3/10. So 3/10, 30/100ths, those are all the same type of thing. Okay. When you look at numbers that don't have that number in the bottom, so let's say it's not a 10, it's not a 100, then what do we do? Well, if we look at that, what we're going to do, let's say we have 1/2. If we have 1/2, a fraction we're familiar with, how do I get it to my decimal point? Well, in order to get it to my decimal point, I want to take, and the numerator goes inside that box, the denominator goes outside the box. Okay, so we have the numerator inside, the denominator's outside, and if you remember my little story about stuff, we can say the denominator is knocking at the door. Door, denominator. They're outside the door. Okay, the numerator's inside the house there. Now what we have to do is we're going to put the decimal point and add 2 zeros to the end of it. So we're going to put that decimal point right up there where it belongs, and then we do our division. How many 2's can we get out of 10? We can get 5. 5 times 2 is 10. We have that subtract, sister subtract. We have 0, brother in town, so bring them on down. How many 2's can we get out of 0? 0. Keep going. 0 times 2 is 0. Subtract, and we have nothing left over. So our decimal would be 0.50 or 51/100ths. And then to get that to the percent, just move our decimal point over 2 or multiply it by 10, and we would get 50%. Okay. Now sometimes we have a decimal and it's not so, or a fraction, and it's not so nice and easy and getting that answer. So what we do is we still continue to find the decimal. So let's say my fraction, or let's start with that percent of 33. Yeah, if we have that fraction of 1/3, let's start with 1/3. Okay, I have 1/3 is a fraction. Again, to find my decimal, I'm going to do the same thing. But this time it's going to be a little different, because when I divide it out, and I've added those 2 zeros again, we sister subtract, we get 1, we bring down our 0. How many 3's can we get out of 10? 3. 3 times 3 is 9. And I get that 1. And if I were to keep going, it would be the same over and over and over again. So I would keep getting that 3 and 3 and 3. Now I can do, for the percent, I could do 33 and 1/3. Okay, so I could take that 1, that becomes my numerator. This 3 becomes the denominator. So for the percent, we'd say it's 33 and 1/3%. For a decimal. For a decimal, because that 3 continues to repeat itself, we could write it as the decimal point, the 33, and this little line like that over the top, this line here, indicates that it repeats. That means to repeat itself. So no matter how long we keep going, we're going to get that 3. 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. So we can do that, and we can say that it ends up being 0.33 with that repeated sign above it. Okay? If you look in your books at some of your examples, they do have a whole thing about activities and fractions. You can make your own fraction pieces if you want and go through that. Otherwise, just look at the examples they give you there. As far as knowing whether something's larger or smaller, when we have 2 fractions or 2 decimals or a decimal and a fraction, we have to make them into one particular type. So if we're looking at fractions, we need to make them both fractions. If we're looking at percents, we look at both percents. One of the things with decimals, so let's say this is an example on page 460 of your book, number 6. It has this number, and then it has a greater than, less than, or equal to sign. And then it has this number here. Okay? Now remember what I taught you before. You look at, if there's, the first number is the same there, 0 and 0, then we can look at the number that comes right after the decimal point. Here we have a 1, here we have a 2. Because I have a 2 here and a 1 here, 2 is greater than 1, so I'm going to make it into the 125 thousandths is less than 2 tenths, or you can make it into that thousandths if you want and add those 2 little zeros at the end, 200 thousandths. So we can still look and say, okay, let's compare the first number and go on from there. Okay? So just if you have any questions about that, you can contact me, or you can also go on Khan Academy. They do have some videos that might help too with that. Okay? I hope you're doing well this week as we are trying to get through working together online.